This is a conversation. That's the point of this. This is not a debate, and it's a conversation. Most of you, I think, or a good number of you here know me. I am Brad Epperly. I'm a professor of political science here. And I'm just going to be the host this evening. And I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, the philosopher Renaud-Philippe Garner, to sort of give you a sense of what this evening is going to look like. And then he will introduce our speakers. And they're going to just each give about a 15 to 20 minute presentation about their research on DEI. And then we are going to have them have about a 15-minute conversation back and forth, at which point 2 of our exceptional undergrads are going to come up here and speak for about 5 minutes each and sort of give counterpoints or ask questions or give different perspectives. And during that point in time, I hope you all will be using Slido, and there'll be a slide about using Slido to ask questions of our speakers. And we're going to spend about half an hour at the end then with an audience Q&A. So, you know, if there's something here that you think about, start typing it on your phone maybe when you think about it so you don't forget about it later. And on that note, let's all turn off our phones. We all do this, right? Check your ringers, just because I can assure you it can be distracting for those of us who are up here. So, again, thank you so much for coming. And I'm going to introduce now Renaud-Philippe Garner.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir, et merci de passer la soirée avec nous. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for spending tonight with us. I'd like to echo Brad's sentiment of gratitude. Obviously, without the generosity, this evening would not be possible, but I'd like to say a few words about the way in which this conversation is supposed to occur. And our topic is DEI, that's right, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And we'll be discussing this as he mentioned, our distinguished guests, talented undergraduates, and of course you, the audience. But a heterodox conversation is about approach and aims. Our focus is on the process of academic inquiry, not on opinions or what we might call views. Our speakers will surely disagree on several things, they may even agree on others, but this isn't about identifying a winner and a loser. To focus on academic inquiry is to focus on how scholars investigate, or perhaps more accurately, given the nature of the world, how they should investigate their topic and research, and how they should reach informed conclusions with the available evidence. The goal of a heterodox conversation is to reveal the process of discovery and reasoning that results in conclusions, whatever they might be. Of course, at the end of our conversation, you may find one speaker's arguments, analyses, evidence more compelling, perhaps even irresistibly compelling. So much the better. But what we truly hope is that you learn how academic inquiry is or should be conducted, and that you partake in some measure yourselves by asking further questions and engaging in further thought. So the guidelines, in a way, for a heterodox conversation are nothing more than the guidelines for any well-reasoned and evidence-based conversation. You'll need to use reason and evidence, but we also need more than that. We need to be charitable towards other positions and our interlocutors. We need to show some dose of intellectual modesty, just some, and we need to engage constructively. Tonight we're fortunate to have 2 distinguished speakers, Azim Shariff and Paolo Gaudiano. Azim Shariff is a full professor and a Canada Research Chair in the Department of Psychology at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. You know, the other campus. A social psychologist, his research focuses on the intersection of morality with religion, culture, and economics, and he's also interested in human-technology interactions and the ethics of automation. You can find his scholarship as it's appeared in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and Nature, to name a few. Paolo Gaudiano is an Adjunct Associate Professor at the New York University Stern School of Business. In addition to being an academic with degrees in mathematics, engineering, and computational neuroscience, he is also a social entrepreneur. He's the founder and president of Aleria Research Corp, a nonprofit that seeks to change how we think about diversity and what we do about it. You can find his scholarly papers in avenues such as Applied Sciences or the International Journal of Robotics and Automation, and his outreach pieces in venues such as Forbes. But introductions ought not be too long. Without further ado, I give you our speakers, and first up, Azim Shariff. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for those introductions, and thank you guys for having me here at the other campus. DEI is a big topic. I'm not going to talk about all of it. I want to talk about, and I hope this isn't too inside baseball, but I want to talk about diversity in faculty hiring. Now, some of us here are hired faculty. Some of us aspire to be that. But I think all of us have been taught by a very select set of hired faculty. So we all have a stake in who gets hired as faculty. The reason why I'm particularly interested in this topic requires me to go into a bit of an origin story. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to go a few decades back, way back to the 90s, back when the air was free of Wi-Fi and the music was awesome. So today happens to be, I just realized this on the taxi over here, today happens to be the 30th anniversary of the death of Kurt Cobain. And it's interesting that if you chart his life, you see how much things have changed in terms of our attitudes towards things like race. The year he was born, 1967, was the year that in the United States, the Supreme Court put a ban on any laws against interracial marriage. That was 1967. That's pretty recently. The year Cobain died, at the age of 27, in 1994, still only 48% of the country actually supported interracial marriage. But that continued to linearly increase at the same pace throughout. And so 27 years later, 2021, that number had gone up to 94%. Now these are, as will be all the statistics that I tell you, from the United States. But I do remember, at least anecdotally, that those attitudes towards race, that progression over all that time, seems to track what it was like here in Canada. I grew up in Vancouver, a white majority Vancouver, in the 90s. And I remember, and I don't know whether it was Vancouver, whether it was the 90s, whether it was just being a kid, but I remember that my race was a topic. I was treated differently because of my race. I remember one time being pulled over by a police officer who looked at my license and he said, whoa, I wouldn't want to be sitting next to you on an airplane. Now at that point, I didn't know enough to be offended by that, and I'm glad I didn't, because I was a bit of a lippy kid, and that's not a situation where you want to be lippy. But you fast forward now to the aughts. I'm an undergraduate at University of Toronto, and then eventually a graduate student at UBC in Vancouver. The music has gotten worse, but it's tolerable. There's some of it that's pretty good. But the question of my race doesn't come up nearly as much anymore. At school, I'm judged on my work, and in my budding academic career, I'm judged on my ideas. And there are a few comments here and there. Airports were no fun for a while, but in my work, my race is a non-factor. Then we get to the 2010s. The music is terrible. I have my first position as an assistant professor. This is the University of Oregon. And bit by bit, identity comes back into the center, but in a transformed way. So I get asked to serve on all of the newly formed EDI committees, first at Oregon, then at UC Irvine, then at UBC. And the refocusing on identity is happening. It's coinciding with a time when in the United States, at least, and I think in Canada as well, people are becoming more pessimistic about the state of race relations. So this is a chart which shows the percentage of people who worry a great deal about race. And you can see how it splits by the decades here. So here are the aughts. You see right by the end of it, 2010, it reaches the lowest point that it had since they were looking at it, 13%. But from 2010 on, it starts increasing again. This next one zooms out a little more. In general, do you think that the US race relations are total good or total bad? And you see right around the turn of the millennium, it crosses over to more people thinking it's totally good than totally bad. But then around 2010, it starts moving in the other direction until it crosses over again, where we essentially flip from where we were back in 2010. You can zoom out even further. This is a perception of how much racism there is. So black people have as good a chance as white people in your community to get any kind of job for which they're qualified. This is the percentage agreeing. And you see again that it's increasing from when they first measured it in the 1960s. There's your aughts decade. It's reaching its peak again at 2010, and then it falls. And it falls to a point lower than it's ever been in my lifetime. If you split this by white and black respondents, you see that the black Americans have nowhere near as rosy a view of this as the white Americans, but it does follow the same pattern, the same arc. And you actually see the same thing for gender relations. So same type of question, but whether women have the same opportunities, you see this same arc. So it's against this backdrop that I get hired at UBC in 2018. And it's relevant because when I was hired here, my race was a factor in the decision. So I came under this Canada 150 Research Chair program. This is something that the federal government did for Canada's 150th birthday in 2017. And they had every department in every discipline in every university compete, send in nominations for people that they would get some money then to hire at their department. And in the call, they said, there's a preference for members of 4 equity-deserving groups: women, Indigenous persons, people with disabilities, and racialized minorities. And so the UBC psychology department, who knew that they were going to be competing against all these other departments, thought, well, to maximize our chances, let's only nominate people from those 4 groups. Why take the chance? So that's what they did, and it worked out well for them. And it worked out well for me because I got to come back to this great university, and it has been great. But I came back knowing that I was there under a different set of criteria than all my other colleagues had been hired. Yes, it was partly because of my research and teaching, but it was also partly because of these immutable characteristics that were really just an accident of birth for me. And not only did I know that, but I knew that all my colleagues knew that as well. And not only that, but my department had significantly reduced the potential pool of applicants from which they could have been choosing. And those are costs. For whatever benefits they might bring, those are costs, which only means that we should have good reasons for paying them. The problem is that those reasons have never been made clear to me. And as I've sat on more search committees, I've found that, well, nobody really talks about those reasons. They're assumed, but we sort of skip the part where we discuss why we are pursuing diversity. And then when you ask people about it, it seems that they implicitly hold some set of often different and often contradictory rationales. So one of the reasons we don't talk about it is that for some percentage, diversity has become a bit of a sacred value. And my longest running research area is the psychology of religion. We talk about sacred values quite a bit. There's a lot of research on that. And they have a particular set of psychological characteristics. One, they tend to be about emotionally charged issues of moral importance. 2, protecting them tends to be tied to individual and group identities. 3, they tend to be resistant to compromise and trade-offs. And 4, questioning them tends to be met with outrage. And even for the people who don't see diversity as a sacred value, they may think that it's beyond questioning because it's just common sense that it's something that we should be pursuing. But we as academics are in the business of interrogating what seems like common sense, of questioning things that are unquestioned, and of resisting the worship of sacred cows. And so to not do so on this topic would be failing to live up to the standards that we set for every other question. So I kind of made it a bit of a mission to identify what these actual rationales are, to make explicit what is implicit, so that we can have an open discussion about them. And that's been something that I've been working on during my sabbatical for the last few months. This is the list, oh, that's what I did. This is the list of the 10 that I've identified. These are 10, I think, to various degrees, meritorious rationales for why we should be considering diversity in faculty hiring. And this is the key slide of my presentation, so I'm gonna leave it up here. I don't have time to talk about each of them because I spent all that time talking about Kurt Cobain, but I'll talk about a couple of them because a couple of them I think illustrate points that I wanna make. And the first one is this top one, avoiding hiring biases. And I've put this in a family called hidden merit because what hiring biases do is they interfere with our ability to be able to figure out the most meritorious candidate. So if we have a homogeneous faculty, our worry is that the faculty might be homogeneous because the hiring has been biased. People have a natural tendency for homophily, to like people who they are like. And that natural tendency could get in the way of seeing who's gonna be your best candidate, especially if that best candidate is different from you. So we might overlook people who are different from us, and as a result, recreate the same type of people that they're actually doing the hiring decisions. Importantly though, homogeneity and bias aren't exactly the same thing. A faculty might be homogeneous because of hiring biases, but you might see homogeneity also for other reasons. It could be that there weren't opportunities for people to get into the qualified pool of applicants. It could be that there's also cultural differences. So I am an Asian social psychologist. I could tell you that it is no Asian parent's dream that their kid grows up to become a social psychologist. So if you see a disparity of South Asians in psychology, it's not necessarily because psychology is biased against Asians in favor of white people. It's more likely that Asians are biased against psychology in favor of becoming a cardiologist or something. So that is a bit of an innocuous example, but it does go to show why we can't unproblematically conflate disparity with discrimination, and we can't unproblematically conflate diversity with fairness. And that's kind of too bad, because it's much easier to measure diversity than it is to measure bias. To measure diversity, you just do a head count, which is what we did in my department. We did a head count, there's a disparity. But to actually measure bias, you need this very large and contentious social psychological literature. We've been trying to do it for a long time, and we can talk about it a little more, maybe during the discussion. But I want to move on to the second one, which is in the role modeling family. This is improving educational outcomes. And this is one that I found very persuasive going into the project, because it's one that's actually discussed reasonably often, and often with a long trail of empirical citations. But then I spent some time digging into those citations, and what I found, to my surprise, was that there wasn't this ringing, overwhelming body of evidence behind it, at least at the higher ed level. There may be at the primary school level and the secondary school level, but the higher ed level, you have a lot of papers. Some of them do show positive effects, but the results overwhelmingly are mixed. There's this one paper by Koch and Zahidi from 2018 that put it very well. They said, for every study that concluded that there was some type of role model effect at work in higher ed, there was another that asserted that such an effect was insignificant. And when you factor in publication bias, which tends to understate null effects, my read of literature is that we just don't have the evidence base there, at least not a strong one. If there was a big effect for a positive effect of teacher match or just general diversity on the outcomes for students, be it measured by graduation rates or grades, we would have detected it. There may be an effect there, but it's likely a small one, which isn't to say that it's an insignificant one, but I think that that effect size needs to be balanced against the costs that we talked about earlier. Okay, so now we're in the 2020s. Let's not even talk about it. When it comes to DEI, we are fully in backlash territory now. There's a backlash to the backlash. And this is unfortunate because I don't think that there are very good answers at the other end of the pendulum here. The anti-DEI bills that are being passed in Florida and elsewhere are not the way. in a way, they're more of the same sort of top-down imposition of political agendas. They just happen to be different political agendas. And they're a good reminder that it's going to be very tempting for whoever is in power to try to win a debate by shutting other people out of it. And it's a good reminder of how precious it is to have an open academy where, in the words of Jonathan Rauch, we protect dissent rather than trying to protect us from dissent. And that's why I'm very glad that this conversation is a conversation and not a debate, because I think actually Paolo and I are on the same side here. I think we're kind of one of the same. We're both, I think, quantitatively oriented, evidence-based scholars who are really concerned about pragmatic policies that are judged on their consequences. Now, I heard that there was going to be a big PPE contingent here, so I figured I should quote at least one political scientist here. So I'm going to quote Samuel Huntington. I don't know what the status of Samuel Huntington is in political science these days. Maybe somebody can fill me in. But Huntington said this interesting thing. He said about the United States that it wasn't a lie, but it was a disappointment. And what he meant by that was that there was nothing inherently or inevitably wrong with the ideals that the United States was founded on. It just repeatedly failed to live up to them. And I think we could say something similar about diversity and inclusion, and maybe equity, depending on your definition of it. I think that those are good values to pursue, but I think that the DEI industry has been a disappointment. So most of the advocates for DEI are reasonable, fair-minded people, but the fear and the frustration is that there's some who are using DEI policies just to exclude people who think differently. I was on a search committee. I won't tell you which university is that. I've been at a number of them. We were talking about our preferences for a minority candidate. And then one of my colleagues there said, but of course we don't want a Clarence Thomas. Now, I don't like Clarence Thomas's politics or his voting record or his judicial philosophy or his ethics. But Clarence Thomas would add a lot of diversity on a lot of dimensions to our department. And he would do so under a lot of these different rationales. So he actually would be a great candidate. But people want to stack the deck for people on their own team. Again, that's a natural thing to do, and it's understandable. It's just antithetical to the mission of a university. The challenge of liberalism and of pluralism, and why these were such hard-won societal achievements, is to resist our natural tendencies towards preference and parochiality. We have to hire people that we don't like. Now, there are other reasons that I've been disappointed in some of the DEI policies and rhetoric. So another one is that not only do they tend to gloss over the costs and the trade-offs, but they often make talking about those a taboo, which is another good indication that there are sacred values at play. But it doesn't have to be this way. So if DEI is lost, if it's lost its way, here are 4 waypoints that I think you can use to find its way back. So the first one is be honest about what the aims of your DEI policies are. If your goal is role modeling, well then say that and tell the people that you're hiring that. If your goal is social restitution, well then be honest about that too. 2, be rigorous in evaluating how these policies actually fulfill these aims. So academics occupy a special role in society, and they do so because we have an expertise. But that expertise gets its credibility because of an adherence to a rigorous set of rules about evidence. If we choose to throw away those rules or just relax them because of activism, or because we're pursuing a sacred cause, then with that, we throw out the expertise and the credibility as well. 3, be open about the trade-offs. So diversity and inclusion, we're gonna talk about this the whole evening. These are good values. These are good values to pursue, but they're not the only ones. There's also fairness and merit and autonomy and openness and truth. And these aren't always in conflict with diversity and inclusion, but they're not always perfectly aligned either. And part of what being a grown-up is recognizing that you can't have everything at once. There are trade-offs between these, and we have to work out how those trade-offs are going to play out. There are going to need to be compromises, and we have to recognize that when you do compromise, you lose something that you really care about. And then finally, rather than trying to control the debate by discouraging dissent and insulating us in orthodoxy, do what we do with all the rest of our academic work, which is expose it to the strongest form of criticism and then use evidence and argument to persuade. So there's one thing that will be certain about the direction that this goes. These 2020s will roll into the 2030s and the 2040s. And it's not going to be Brad and me and Paolo who are sitting on these committees and running these universities. It's going to be the students here. So what are you guys going to do? The music is going to suck. You guys are going to hate it. So you might as well get fixing the academy. Thank you.
So this was great. I have to say I was really, really impressed. This was a phenomenal presentation. It's really quite an honor to be here. I'm delighted that all of you took the time to be here and join us today. And I'm very grateful to Azim. And actually, it was very interesting listening to Azim that it's almost like we're almost like opposites of each other in some very weird asymmetrical ways. And one way in which we're very similar is that we both use elephants at the beginnings of our slides. What's up with that? So I always like to talk about the white elephant in the room, which is me. And this is where I saw some very interesting parallels and sort of like mirror images. So I was born and raised in Italy, but I came to the States when I was relatively young. I was at the end of high school. So I'm now a dual citizen, but I am white, male, cisgender, heterosexual. I literally have all the privilege in the world. And as far as being a foreigner, it means that I get to spend about half of the year in Rome. I split my time between New York and Rome. Woe is me, privilege really sucks, right? So I have all the privilege. So what am I doing talking on the pro side, if you will, about DEI? Although again, I don't see this very much as a debate. And as you will see, actually, I think that Azim and I actually agree on a number of fundamental points. So I came into this field after being first a full-time professor. I was a tenure professor at Boston University, where I was working in computational neuroscience, understanding how neurons work together to give us perception and understanding and things of that sort. And then eventually, I ended up migrating out of that space and becoming an entrepreneur. And most of the work that I did was taking similar ideas of understanding how an individual within a collective interacts and how does the behavior of the collective influence the individual and the other way around. And one day, I had been very interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion on the personal level. And I was sitting in on a conference and I'd been going always to these sessions about like, how do we get more people of color into advertising? How do we get more women into leadership roles? And I was really struck by the distinction between the poignant stories that I heard people share. But when it came to solutions, they were very vague. We need to change the hearts and minds of corporate America, or we need to change the education system in Canada, or whatever the case might be. And as I was sitting there contemplating this, what seemed to be an insurmountable gap, I thought, wait a second. This is what I've been doing at that point for more than 20 years. I've been figuring out how to connect the individual to the collective. What if I could take my work and actually apply it to something that I care about personally? And so that's how a guy like me ended up being in the space doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I literally dropped everything that I was doing. It was 2015, and I started to do some research based on the work that I've been doing before. You'll see a little glimpse of that in a moment. And I jumped into this field, and the rest is history. And now I wear multiple hats. I have a small nonprofit doing research. I wear an academic hat at NYU, and I also have a startup called Aleria. Now, some of the work that I'm going to be talking to you about is related to my startup, and we work a lot with corporations. And the reason for that is because I believe that ultimately we need to convince corporates that there is financial interest in embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion in ways that will become hopefully more apparent as I keep speaking. Some of the things that I talk about will be related, again, to corporations, but I think you'll see how to relate very easily to academic environments as well. When I started working in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was around 2020, I don't have music, sorry, I have very boring slides. I use just like mathematical functions. If you were to look overall at how people felt about DEI, it was a bit of a bell curve. You had some people that were very strongly positive in favor of DEI, some that were kind of strongly against it, but most people were kind of like in between, maybe agnostic, maybe slightly skeptical, maybe slightly favorable. And then something happened, and in particular, and it was actually very interesting to see what Azim did was very nice because he showed kind of the progression. And a lot of people talk about the murder of George Floyd on May 25th of 2020, and how that was really a catalyst to a massive wave of favor toward DEI, and it kind of shifted the curve to the right, well, really to the left, if you will, from a political perspective, but on the graph there to the right. And that was followed a few years later by backlash. And the backlash right now looks very much like a polarized, like you have two peaks. Most people now cannot be neutral about DEI. You either love DEI or you hate DEI. And it feels a little bit like this. And this is, I've been having fun with DALL-E generating some of these images. So you have, the first wave coming over a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, and then the second wave that's now crashing back upon it. And I don't like this. I think this is really problematic. And one of the things that happened when I started to work in 2015 is that I realized very quickly that a lot of the things that Azim also talked about, a lot of the shortcomings of the people that took DEI as a sacred cow were going to lead to backlash. And I wrote an article, I write a lot for Forbes. This is what happens when you're no longer a full-time academic. You write one academic paper every 5 years and you write 50 blogs a year, and it's kind of a substitute for that. But I wrote a blog in which I said, if DEI supporters continue to push on recruiting and representation alone, it's going to create backlash. It's going to create backlash from primarily white men who will complain about it. They will complain about reverse discrimination, and it might attack institutions such as some of the things that we saw recently with affirmative action in the United States. I wrote that article in April of 2018, so it was pretty prescient from that perspective. So when I came into the space, if the clicker is working, there you go, I was expecting this kind of backlash that we're seeing right now in every facet of society. And I was worried about it. But what it did is that it helped me when the backlash actually came to understand why and to try to do something about it. So I want to talk to you by trying to understand essentially what academics should do, which is that how does DEI impact performance? And when you talk to people who are trying to justify in a rational way, but not necessarily in an academic rigorous way, why DEI is good, a lot of times you hear 4 arguments. You hear that it's important to have diversity within an organization so that you can attract more diverse people, whether it's your students, whether it's your colleagues. You also want to be able to retain those people, because once they come in the company, it would be a shame if you went out of your way to use one of those grants to hire Azim and then he didn't like working here at UBC and decided to leave. You also have to realize that people talk about the fact that diversity is good for things like innovation and greater performance of teams. And then of course it has to do with reputation. What most people fail to realize is that these are inextricably tied, and that trying to work on only one of them without the others is actually a mistake. And let me explain what I mean by that. A very typical approach that I've seen is that when an organization tries to figure out how do we make diversity work for us, they almost always focus on one thing only, which is recruitment. And they say, look at this, lo and behold, I'm going to recruit some people from different backgrounds and my diversity goes up. But very often, and this is especially true in the corporate environment, you bring those people in, and what happens? They don't feel welcome. The leadership doesn't look anything like them. Their colleagues don't know how to deal with them. They feel like they're not treated properly, so they leave. So your retention goes down. And when they leave, they wreak havoc, because now you got to go and hire somebody else, you got to retrain them, the rest of the team is left kind of up in the air. So that actually has a negative impact on performance as well. And then of course it has a bad impact on reputation, because now the people inside the organization are saying, wait a second, we tried it with those people, but it didn't work out. And meanwhile, those people are actually going to their friends and saying, don't go to that organization because it's not good for us, which means that you're actually having a negative impact on what you were trying to do in the first place. And on top of that, you create massive backlash. Why do you create backlash? Well, the problem with this approach is that you are essentially solving for the symptoms instead of trying to understand the problem. And I like to use an analogy. Imagine that I came home one day in the winter and it was very cold. I look at the thermostat and it reads 15 degrees Celsius. I changed it. So what am I going to do? I know how to fix that. I'll light a match under the thermostat. And look, the temperature just went up. 20, 25, 30, 35. But meanwhile, the windows are drafty, the front door is open, and the roof is leaking. And I might burn the house down. And when we focus on DEI, and we only look at the D, and we only look at recruitment, we're making exactly the same mistake. And what it does is it causes people to say, this is reverse discrimination. And in fact, it is reverse discrimination. Imagine that you have a company, or any kind of an organization, maybe it's an academic institution that has 1,000 employees. And with those 1,000 employees, you have 30% or 20% that are white women, identify as white women, 5% that identify as women of color, 5% that identify as men of color, and the rest identify as white men. So it looks something like that. And imagine that now the leaders come out and say, you know what, we see the light, diversity is great. So let's go ahead and increase those numbers. Let's set 3 years targets in which we're going to move up to 30% women, 8% men of color, 8% women of color. And because we think that diversity is so great, we believe that we're going to grow successfully by 20% over the 3 years. So it's really going to be a much better company. But the problem is that when you look at the numbers, you're going to realize that the only way you're going to get there is by increasing the number of white women, of men of color, women of color, and decreasing the number of white men. And that is discrimination on the basis of race and gender, and it's not good. However, I would submit to you that the problem with this is that the entire argument is based on the wrong ideas. It's a flawed approach to the whole argument. And as long as we keep arguing that, that's always going to be a problem. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you look at the data that's only based on the overall level of diversity of an organization, you're missing out on a very important point. The bar that I'm showing you right now on the left is the representation of the same 4 identity groups based on real data from McKinsey and Lean In, and it's based on virtually across every company in the United States. There are similar numbers in other countries as well, although the US has the uniqueness of the racial disparity there is a little bit different than some other countries. So these data are particularly to the US. The numbers that you see are the representation levels of those 4 groups at the entry level. As people progress through the organization, this is what happens. White men pick up a staggering 23% additional representation as they go from entry level to C-suite executives. Which means that the problem is not that we're not hiring enough people. The problem is that we're leaking people out. It's a leaky bucket problem. Pouring more water in from the top, like we try to do, is counterproductive. And trying to fight fire with water, just not going to work. So how do we solve this problem? How do we address this issue and avoid burning down the house by trying to light a match on the thermostat? What I'm going to ask people, and this is what I usually do when I talk, is to say, if you happen not to have all the privilege that I have, if you happen to have been subjected to some of the kinds of horrible things that I hear happen to people, and you were to be working in that company, which would you prefer to see if 3 years from now you happen to pop into the company or open your eyes and it's 3 years from now? Would you prefer to see that you've hit exactly the targets that you'd set out to hit, but you're still treated like crap? People don't listen to you, they interrupt you during meetings, they don't invite you to the meetings where you should be, you're not compensated for the work that you do. Or would you prefer that maybe the numbers are not quite exactly where you were hoping they would be, but your ideas are actually respected. You're recognized for your contributions. You have the opportunity someday to become the boss of the organization. Well, what I submit to you is that if you want what's on the left, you want diversity. If you want what's on the right, you want inclusion. The problem is that we look at data, we go in a company, right? The way that I think this happened historically since the 1960s in the United States and similarly in many other countries in the world, is that people knew that things were not right. And the only thing they could measure was diversity. And they could see that the numbers are wrong. So the diversity became like the currency, became what they hung on to. And then they're like, well, we need to fix diversity. But diversity is the outcome, and that's where the problems have been arising. So what I propose instead is that we think carefully about what DEI actually is, because when we talk about has DEI lost its way, I would argue that if you go out and you ask 100 people what DEI means, you will get 100 different answers, especially when it comes to inclusion and equity. Diversity, relatively easy to define. The other two, good luck finding a consistent definition. So the way that I define it is based on the point of view of the organization. And again, this is my bias because I believe that the day that I can convince organization leaders to do certain things is the day that we will change the economy and we will change society. So here, I'm going to show you my definitions. From the point of view of an organization, inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get, and equity is what you want. Very easy, but of course I need to explain what that means, right? What do I mean by that? Let me start with inclusion. Imagine you have a team. This could be a team in your class, it could be a bunch of faculty in the department, it could be employees of an organization. And this is the perfect team, meaning that each individual is performing at their absolute peak, and as a team they work really, really well together. You cannot get 1 ounce of greater performance and satisfaction than you can out of this team. Now imagine something happens that causes one individual of this team to be unable to perform at their peak. What's going to happen to the performance of the team? It's going to decline. Now suppose that something happens to a second member of the organization, of the team. not only is the performance going to decline because you've lost the performance of 2 team members, but now you're going to see ripple effects because the rest of the team is going to get frustrated because all of a sudden they will have to pick up the slack, they will not be able to finish jobs on time. And so very soon, everybody's going to get frustrated and the performance of the entire team is going to decline precipitously. Now, I haven't said anything about race, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability of these individuals. But this very simple thought experiment leads to a really profound conclusion. Any organization, anything that an organization does that causes any of its people to be less able to perform their work because of personal identity traits is actually impacting the whole organization negatively. In other words, forget the sacred cow, forget diversity for the sake of diversity. If you're doing anything in your organization today that is causing some of your team members to be underperforming for reasons that have nothing to do with their skills and capabilities, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. Flip it around, say, well, if you can find things that are interfering with people's ability to perform and you fix them, you can actually perform better as an organization and people will be happier. Which makes sense because ultimately we talk about organizations, but it's not like the university says, oh, look, there are some black people coming, close the doors. No, the organization is nothing but the collection of all the people that make it up, which means that everything that the organization does or everything that we all do within the organization has an impact on everybody else and on the well-being of the organization. So what we need to understand and what we need to quantify and what I do for a living is to quantify that, to try to understand how the things that go on in an organization actually impact not only the people, but also the organization. And I'm going to show you a very specific example that will show you the background that I came from, which is building computer simulations of social systems to show you how you can actually quantify this. So, and I'm going to look at a very particular example which has to do with what happens if there are biases in the way that people are promoted on the basis of their gender. So here's a company or a university, it doesn't really matter. This could be assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, chairs. Or it could be entry-level management VPs and executives. And for simplicity, there are 2 kinds of people, blue and yellow. And let's think of blue as being men, yellow as being women. I am not suggesting gender is binary, but just for simplicity, you will see why. So here goes the simulation. I'm going to run for the equivalent of 5 years. People move around, some of them get promoted, some of them leave, you can see them, they turn gray and disappear. But eventually, when you run this for the equivalent of 5 years, you find that the organization always stays balanced roughly 50-50 at every level. So then I asked myself, I said, well, what if the company was not being fully inclusive? What if there was a bias so that when it comes to promoting people, if you're a man, you're going to get a slight leg up? Not that that ever happens in any real organization, right? But so what if this organization was practicing exclusion? So I change 1 parameter in the simulation and I run it again. I start 50-50. I made this video go slightly faster. I run for the equivalent of 5 years. Let's see what happens. Lo and behold, this is what it looks like 5 years later. 80% men at the top, 70% men at the next level down, and so on down to the bottom level. Does this look familiar at all? And all I've done is it changed 1 very simple parameter. Now, it turns out that the familiarity is not just coincidental, and because I am an academic at heart, my colleague Chibin Zhang and I took the simulation and ran it hundreds and hundreds of times and took data from every industry for which we had data from McKinsey Lean studies. And we were able to match very accurately by changing literally only 1, actually in this case 2 parameters. How many were at the entry level, and then we just changed 1 parameter that was a consistent level of bias at all levels of the organization in promotions. And as you can see, we can capture the data quite accurately. And in the academic paper that we published last year, we also did a whole bunch of other experiments. So what does that tell you? That tells you that inclusion drives diversity. Inclusion drives diversity. If you do not have the prerequisite ingredients in an organization, you will never achieve the diversity that you want, no matter how many people you stuff in at the entry level. But I'm going to argue that inclusion also gives you performance. And in fact, if you remember, I talked about inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get, but I also said equity is what you want. What do I mean by that? Well, in the simulation, one thing that's very cool is that we can put electrodes in the brains of these little people, right? And we can figure out what they're doing. And what we do is we have 1 variable that we call satisfaction. And that normally stays high, but when somebody gets passed over for promotion, their satisfaction will temporarily dip down and then come back up again. But if it keeps happening, this is what happens. The men are getting promoted. Hey, they deserve it. They're happy. The women, on the other hand, are frustrated. because they're constantly getting passed over for promotion, much more so frequently than men. What's going to happen to people that are frustrated? Their productivity will go down, their performance will go down, as we talked about the little example earlier, and they're going to leave the organization. And that costs money. You are literally bleeding money out because of how you're treating your people. How does this have to do with equity? Well, that gap is a form of inequity. If only you could identify these inequities and treat women the same way that we treat men in this example, or indigenous people, or people with disabilities, or queer people, you would be gaining money that you're throwing out the window right now. And when I talk to corporates, I use this argument because that's what they care about. They care about money. But even in a university, it may have to do with student retention. It may have to do with faculty retention. When you lose people, it's not a good thing. When they're not producing because they're upset, it's not a good thing. So we need to stop asking whether diversity alone influences performance, and we need to realize that it's inclusion that is at the base of an organization that is both more diverse and more highly performing. Which, by the way, sometimes, and I realize that this is also a very debated point, but some people claim to have found some correlations between the level of diversity of an organization and its performance. Now, other people are arguing the correlations are not there. The whole argument is useless because correlations are completely pointless. Correlations are not causality. If you find that there's a correlation between people's yellow teeth color and the probability that they have lung cancer, and then you say, oh, I know, I'm gonna sell you a tooth whitener, and that's gonna cure lung cancer, you would laugh me off the stage. And trying to claim that because there is a correlation, it means that there's causality is a very dangerous game to play. And instead, understanding that creating more inclusion does both, I think helps to understand a lot of the reasons why sometimes we see correlations, sometimes we don't. So if you believe what I've been telling you, which is that we should be focusing on inclusion, why aren't people doing that? Why aren't organizations measuring inclusion? And this was another breakthrough understanding that we had doing our research, which is that inclusion itself is invisible. And I don't know if you can even see the word invisible up on the screen. And I like to use another analogy, this time with health. When I introduced myself today, I didn't say, hi, I'm Paolo and I'm very healthy. Although if you'd seen me back there, I actually had a problem with my sciatica a couple of weeks ago, and I was literally sitting down because like, oh, my back is hurting, right? But the point is that normally we don't notice when we are healthy, we notice when we are sick. Similarly, people tend not to notice when they're being included, but they're much more likely to notice when they're being excluded. Now, here's what becomes a very profound observation. I love profound observations. If you are a healthy individual, you don't know a lot about diseases. Until 3 weeks ago, I did not really know where the sciatic nerve started and ended. I do now, believe me. And if you told me about it, I would have said like, yeah, whatever, sciatica, yeah, it hurts. And then I was in bed for a week and I was like, oh, that was not good. So the point being, if you're healthy, you tend not to know what diseases are, you tend not to know what the symptoms are, you do not know how to cure them. Inclusion works the same way. If you're very included all the time, if you're the least likely to be excluded, you do not know what the symptoms are, you may not believe them if you hear them, and you don't know how to fix them. However, whereas everyone in this room has been sick at some point in their life, if you are the leader of an organization and you're white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, and have all the privilege in the world, you have no clue. Which means that the very people that are supposed to make the decisions that influence our organization are the least qualified to understand it or know how to fix it. And this is a profound problem. And when I hear people in DEI say, oh, the backlash is because white supremacy wants to hold on to its power. I'm sorry, but that's just wrong. I know a lot of really good leaders that would love to do the right thing if we gave them the right tool, if we gave them the right evidence, if we showed to them that it actually worked. And we're not doing that because we're measuring the wrong things. But we can take this analogy a step further and realize that when you go see a doctor, they don't just ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good do you feel today? That would be useless. They ask you about your symptoms. Why? Because if they recognize certain symptoms, they can tell what disease you have, and then they can help you to fix it. And we thought, let's do the same thing. Instead of focusing on asking people, how inclusive is your organization? How included do you feel? Again, go to the doctor and they say like, we decided that to improve your health, we want to ask you, how good do you think our hospital is? Do you think our hospital is really good to patients? It's like, well, I don't know. Instead, what you do is you ask people what happens to them at work and you classify into symptoms. And that's what we did. We came up with this idea of these categories of experiences where basically anything that interferes with your ability to perform your work, it could be that your IT department is not giving you back your laptop in time, or it could be that somebody's making a very bad remark about your hair or your appearance. All of those can be categorized into the kinds of things that happen to you day in and day out at work, whether it's about promotions, whether it's about compensation, whether it's about your work being recognized. So what we do, and the way that we measure inclusion, is that we do workshops in which I talk about similar things to what I'm saying here, and then we give them access to an online platform where they can go in and they can basically say, okay, here's an experience that I had, completely confidentially. I'll describe an experience, and then I'll categorize it in two ways. First, by telling me what is happening, and secondly, by telling me why is it happening. Is it because of a company policy? Is it because of my leadership, my managers, my HR department? And with those two data points, I now have a very, very clear symptom, and I know what kind of symptom it is. And it turns out that you get incredible and actionable insights. First, you get quantitative data, and I realize let's just say that it's not the most rigorously collected data, but when you see the results, you'll understand that it's probably okay, and even Azim might give me a little bit of a pass on this one. But you get incredibly quantitative data, and then that tells you where the biggest opportunities are. And then you get the qualitative data in terms of the comments. It's almost like doing a focus group, and you understand exactly what is happening. And I'm just going to show you very quickly and then wrap up. But so just to give you an idea of some of the data, we just launched an executive summary of a study that we did. In fact, this is not even officially public data yet. An organization called Women in Cybersecurity. We did a year-long study where we collected data from about 1,000 people. And when we calculated these scores that we've developed that are called the exclusion score, we find that overall, women in the sample report 2.1 times higher exclusion than men. And when we drill down into the categories that I mentioned before, we find that in particular in some categories like being respected and having career and growth opportunities, the differences are staggering. We see, for example, that in respect, women have 2.5 times as much likelihood to have an experience of feeling excluded or being excluded because of that. And in recognition, it's 4.5 times. And these are things that have a huge impact on their success. We can also look at other dimensions because we ask people to share their identity traits. So for example, we see that with every single dimension that we've tested, there is always a benefit to be a member of the majority. We can use this to test intersectionality. And when we get the qualitative data, and by the way, the data that I'm going to show you, we always ask permission for people, if we can share each individual experience they shared, they have to positively say, yes, it's okay to use it in one of your presentations. Let me show you some examples. And these are all academic data that we got. I've worked with a couple of academic institutions. I've been subjected to some uncomfortable gender-related comments when assigned to a team in which I was the only woman. Or external partners will defer to male colleagues on a call rather than addressing me, even when I have a better understanding of the content we're discussing. Or how about work-life balance? I feel like I can't take a sick day or take off for my children because there's too much work and not enough employees. And this was also academic, by the way. And here's an interesting one. The university changed its family leave policy and its policy regarding my ability to use saved sick days, blah, blah, blah. I was excluded from this discussion and I was informed with little notice of the reduction in my leave right before my child was born. The reason why this last one is very interesting to me is that it was a man that shared this. Why am I telling you this? Because it turns out that we had a very interesting revelation when we started to work with inclusion. That when you measure diversity, you create difference. You place people into buckets and you're creating, and I'm going to just pop all of these up here, okay? Diversity is a lagging measure. It takes a long time for diversity to change. Inclusion is something that you measure today. You're placing people into buckets which says, oh, you're different from me. Whereas now we're placing experiences into buckets. It leads to fragmented efforts. Oh, do I support black people, indigenous people, women, people with disabilities, people that are older, people that are younger, people that don't like music from the 90s or the aughts, whatever the case might be. And then lastly, there's a zero-sum game mindset. And this is where I want to go back to the comment from the man. If you think about structural barriers as creating different levels of comfort, of wealth, whatever it might be, between different groups, I don't know if you've ever heard the saying that says that the rising tide lifts all boats equally. With inclusion, it's even better than that because you're actually benefiting mostly the groups that need it the most. Because you're literally, by creating better policies, you will make that man happier, but you also make a whole bunch of women happier because they're the ones that are most impacted by that. And the best part of that is that you don't do the backlash. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm actually writing a book. I've written a book. It's coming out in September, and I'm hoping that the book will really help to counter the backlash and really help us to work toward a more inclusive and more successful society. Thank you.
So I'm trying to think about where we disagree, because in a way you're doing exactly what I was hoping people would do. At the end, I gave these four waypoints for a better DEI, and this does all of them. You were precise about the aims. You were rigorous in evaluating evidence, and then you used the evidence to persuade. So it's great. I really enjoyed the talk. One area where I guess, given my own interests or my own concerns about the academy, where I want to get your thoughts about are our job as professors is not necessarily the satisfaction of our students, right? So the goal is not satisfaction. Retention is nice, but the goal is education. And at times that can be presenting them with ideas which are difficult and not necessarily inclusionary. And what I mean by that is we have seen over the last few months some pretty intense debates on campus where people feel not included because of what other students are saying or because of what professors are saying. And one of the moves that universities are making is they're trying to shut down these debates. And I don't think that's the right way of doing those things, even though that might be the things that would lead to inclusion. So I guess you could say that there are two things going on, which are there's inclusion of ideas, which is necessary for a university, and there's inclusion of people, which is also necessary for universities. But sometimes these can come into tension, and we need to find a compromise between them. What are your thoughts on this?
I completely agree. I mean, I think that there's always this problem. I was joking the other day, my brother and sister-in-law here in the audience were joking about the fact that, intolerance of intolerance is intolerable. And unfortunately right now we've gotten to the point where there's just a lot of intolerance and more so, you talked about the sacred cow and the kind of the interesting analogies between DEI and religion and things of that sort. And unfortunately what's been happening a lot in society is that you tend to only hear the most vocal people, which tend to be the most extreme. And I honestly have no idea what the answer, I mean, I think, once again, I think that we want to be careful about the symptom versus the cause, which is something that is also very interesting about some of the things that you were saying. The fact that there are people that want to get into very acrimonious debates and that they're doing is so that they want to create further polarization is a problem. Now, shutting down those debates and prohibiting people from those debates is probably not the right solution. Is there a better solution? Probably the better solution is to educate people and find people that are, and to be very candid, in academia there's been probably the strongest backlash that I've seen of any other field, which I think is for two reasons. One of them is because as academics, we care about truth and accuracy and backing things up, and we have a very low tolerance for things that are not very rigorous. And so I think that the academic institution as a whole has reacted very strongly to DEI precisely because of the lack of those ingredients in the kinds of people that have been out there. But also I think that, unfortunately, because academics are so smart, a lot of the people that support DEI, they know a lot. And because they know a lot, they will bombard you with a lot of information. And so that can become, again, it can feel like, oh my God, you're just like now flattening me with like all this information about things going back 300 years that I have absolutely nothing to do with. So the answer to your question is, I have no idea. I think that really the best thing that we can do is to, what you're doing, what I'm doing, I think what Heterodox is doing in a way is very beneficial because you need to bring people together to show that there are not necessarily such profound differences, neither in the way that we approach things, nor in the objectives that we want to achieve. I think that the bullet points that you had up there were great, and I think it's one of the first times that I've seen such a cogent explanation of what exactly is it that we're doing. Because again, people say, we want diversity. I don't agree with that. I think most people couldn't care less if you wake up the next morning and, I mean, it's very unpleasant to be, let's say, the only one in a room, but if they're treating you with respect and you don't feel like the only one, then okay, it's not ideal, but it's much better than being maybe 3 of 10 and still being treated horribly. So, I don't know, I guess we'll keep doing what we are doing and keep promoting more sound ideas and hopefully someday converge.
Yeah, I think that's good, and I think here we are kind of preaching to the converted here because this is probably a group that's interested in hearing these types of debates. One thing I've been thinking about lately is that some of the acrimony that we see on campus, some of the strife, the conflict, the tension, the friction that is a consequence of diversity, right? So one of the things you see, you've looked at this literature, I'm sure, as well. One of the challenges of diversity, you get some benefits from it. You get quite a few benefits from it. I think that you're right, there's debates about how strong the evidence is in the corporate sphere. I think that the benefits of diversity, especially viewpoint diversity, but not only, are clear in the academy. but it does come with costs, and some of those costs are coordination costs. So when people have, okay, I'll give you an example. So how many people here are actually professors? And how many of you have done interdisciplinary work, worked with people across, okay, so you might know where I'm going with this, which is that interdisciplinary work can be very rewarding. It can also be extremely difficult, and it's extremely difficult because of these coordination costs. People come with different methodologies, they use different jargon, they have a different set of assumptions, and you spend a lot of time just ironing that stuff out. When you have certain interdisciplinary projects that reach fruition, they can be hugely impactful. But that's a survivorship bias issue. There's a ton of interdisciplinary projects that were started and then fell apart because of these coordination challenges. On university campuses, you have people who speak different languages, people who come with very different cultural norms, people who have different political beliefs, and that causes all this friction that we're seeing now. I'm playing with this idea that friction is a feature, not a bug. That yes, it makes things less pleasant and less harmonious and less orderly. And those are things which maybe align more with inclusion than with diversity. They might be consequences of diversity. But with that friction, what it does is it makes you less lax in your evidence. It makes you reach for a higher standard of evidence. It pushes your ideas further. And the friction prevents us from falling into a kind of groupthinky conformity. The happiness comes from being around people who tell you you're right all the time and that you're good all the time. And it's not nice to be around the other types of people, but that is beneficial to have that, even though it doesn't feel great.
No, this is very interesting, and it brings up a very important difference between academia and the workplace. In the workplace, sadly, the need for engaging creativity, things like that, is much lower than it is in academia. I mean, in academia, that's really like the whole point why you're doing that. And it has, I think that to the extent that there are studies that show the benefits of diversity, they tend to be focused mostly on the kinds of things that happen in academia, where you're trying to do creative innovation, et cetera. When I hear companies say, oh, we need to have diversity for better innovation, it's like, well, how many people in the organization are actually doing innovation? But at university, you're doing that. Now, what I think is shared between the two is that there is both the mechanical aspect of, yeah, let's be more creative by having viewpoint diversity, by having actual maybe geographical diversity, age diversity, socioeconomic diversity, but you also need to have an environment that allows those kinds of diverse viewpoints to exist without creating unnecessary discomfort, and especially without creating unnecessary discomfort to a particular group of people. Now, ironically, one of the things that a lot of people complain about in academia is that academia, by and large, is a left-leaning body. And a lot of people, I would not want to be an ultra-conservative right-wing student at Stanford today, or at UBC Vancouver for that matter. I think that those people are justifiably complaining about the way that they're sometimes treated and shut down. And I've seen data that talks about the fact that in certain environments, especially in academia, in fact, you can quantify the fact that people from a more right-leaning perspective are treated worse. That's inadmissible, right? So what I think we should do is really, it's two things. We should think about ensuring that we encourage people from different backgrounds to come and join our institutions, but also let's make sure that we look at it and try to understand, and whether it's by measuring it the way that we do it or some other way, how are we creating an environment that is not just throwing a bunch of people into a melting pot, but actually encouraging the right kind of dialogue, getting them to, what's that React methodology, right, where you get people to wear each other's shoes and try to argue the other person's point. I think that there are a lot of brilliant minds in academia that are trying to solve some of those things. And we just have to remember that it's not just about the diversity of the team. You have to look at the context in which you're operating.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's in the research on the benefits of diversity, there's something called the diversity hump, which is that you're at your worst. The coordination challenges are at their worst when you have a modest amount of diversity. If you have no diversity, if you've got a homogenous situation, you don't really have these coordination challenges. As you get a little bit of diversity, which is, I think, where universities are in terms of their political diversity. They're at that diversity hump where things are hardest. If you get over the hump, things get easier again because there's no dominant group anymore.
And I wonder, and I apologize, I realized I went over time. I was so excited about it, and I was so motivated and inspired by what you were saying that it talked longer than it should. I don't know whether, at one point we want to have the students participate, but
Yeah, maybe we can move to that.
We had 2 minutes left, but we're happy to move it up.
let's move it up by 2
So,
minutes.
I think you both have earned a hearty round of applause. Thank you very much. So, at this point, you're going to have a bit of a break, and we have 2 undergraduate students who are going to come and provide a bit of a critical feedback. We have Caden Kiewitz, who's a third-year undergraduate student, and who's particularly interested in ethics and meta-ethics, and we have Nayantara Dean, who's a fourth-year PPE student, who's particularly interested in political theory, and they're both going to come up and deliver some remarks, and so hopefully that's somewhat restful for you. Please.
So there we are. They've given me 5 minutes here, so if I go over, throw your tomatoes. So I'm here today to do a critical commentary on Azim Shariff's position, which I do agree with in the main and the most part, but I do think there are some issues that do need to be ironed out. And of course, in talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it's only right that I recognize that I'm on the unceded territory of the Okanagan Syilx people, and that we all recognize and reflect on this fact. So to begin, I'm not sure if you guys remember all the families, I'm not surprised if you didn't, that Azim Shariff talked about, but one of them was social justice, and 2 of those rationales were social restitution and social reorganization. Now, the essence of his argument is that we ought to be empirical and empirically rigorous when we go about DEI policies. They need to be made explicit, and we need to test them to make sure that they're working properly. But the problem with moral properties, such as social restitution and social reorganization, is that they're almost entirely immune to empirical testing, as you can imagine. So, for example, take a tree. Everyone's seen a tree before, or so I hope. And you can look at it, and there's separate cognitive frames to how we go about looking towards it. We can look at it straight and make the quick heuristic judgment that it is indeed a tree. We can move forward, and we can look with our senses, and we can feel it. We can get our primary and secondary perceptions of what it is, and we can get closer and closer. We can look under a microscope of a piece of bark, and we can look down to the very makeup of the tree, down to the individual atoms, and say, okay, yes, this is a tree. Now imagine any moral situation you can come across. Here we can perhaps use maybe an old lady who's having trouble crossing the street, and a young man has come to help. It's very moral. That is not something, the mere fact of him being moral, perhaps being kind, that is not something you can rigorously test for. Obviously, you can imagine you cannot go up to the man and feel his characteristics and say, oh, that's kind. You can't put him under a microscope, and on his skin, it will be really fine print kind. This is something that comes from our brain that we then apply to the world around us rather than being a natural or physical property. So for this family of social justice, it is rather difficult, I would believe, to empirically justify these things. Which does bring me on to my second point, insofar as that the effects of these moral rationales may actually affect our ability to re-augment our DEI policies for other empirically testable domains. So you can imagine another one up there, I'm not sure if you guys remember, was reduced groupthink. So you can imagine reduced groupthink, perhaps it gets tested by a social psychologist, like maybe Azim himself, and it's true, it does indeed reduce groupthink, and that is a wonderful thing, but the misinformation effect does, we believe, to have a cognitive mechanism and a motivational mechanism. We seem motivated at times to keep our false beliefs. And of course, same with our moral beliefs, we are emotionally motivated to keep those beliefs. Those 2 things together can negatively impact our ability to re-augment these policies. You can imagine if someone or some institution policymaker, their 2 main keys were that, reduce groupthink and morality, social justice, social restitution, social reorganization, etc., then you can imagine that maybe if the groupthink, it was rejected and said, well, it doesn't actually really reduce groupthink as much as we want, maybe we need to draw back. If that non-testable realm of morality is tugging on that policymaker's heart, they believe that morality is an important part and that it's something that we should implement, then it may lead us down a path where we are back again with policies that maybe aren't as empirically tested as we may think because we're falling back on beliefs that we are motivated to keep. For my final one, which is a bit smaller of a one, but the framework itself that Azim presents, it implies that some of these implicit rationales will be made explicit. So, for example, another one he put up that may not have been talked about, I don't believe it was institutional signaling. So the idea that institutions, they implement DEI because it makes the place look better. It's good PR, it signals, you know, we care about our students, we care about a diverse student body. But as you can imagine, if those things are made explicit and they're made public, some people who champion DEI, they may very well think that that is a Machiavellian thing to do, to support DEI simply for the sake of making yourself look better. On the other hand, people who don't agree with social restitution or social reorganization, for example, if a company or an institution were to come out and be explicit with the fact that we're doing this for social justice, which again is not empirically testable, but on top of that, it would cause more backlash. So as, oh, there we go. So as we can imagine, thank you, Alarm. As we can imagine, these things can very much cause backlash. Certain disagreements, whether in the moral realm or in institutional signaling, where people may think, well, it's bad that my university doesn't care about diversity, it cares about making itself look better through diversity, that they very well may uproar about it and cause backlash. And then the suspicion that surrounds DEI might actually better be suspicious rather than made explicit if it is going to cause backlash for institution policymakers. And that is all.
Nayantara.
Hi, everyone. So my name's Nayantara, and I'll be responding to Paolo's talk. So as a South Asian woman of color and an intersectional feminist, I do think that it is very important to take diversity, equity, and inclusion very seriously, but I do disagree with how Paolo argues, so I will be discussing those issues. So if inclusion is a necessary condition to secure equity and diversity, as Paolo suggests, but it remains an invisible and unobservable variable, then how can we rationally expect to achieve any of those three ends? So essentially what I'm getting at is, what metrics should we adopt to measure the success or progress of DEI policies? And perhaps we should not at all foreground the least observable variable if we kind of want a pragmatic or effective DEI policy. And just to add on to that, organizations evidently do care immensely about success, whether that's productivity or retention or reputation, the bottom line, profitability. How can we expect them to measure success of something that is inherently invisible? So the next point I'd like to make is about what the goal of DEI is. So Paolo, throughout his presentation, mentions a lot of the aspects of productivity and performance. However, in my opinion, if we talk about inclusion as a means to productivity, we can't reasonably argue that organizations care for inclusion as an end in and of itself. Rather, it seems to me that it's a means to an end, which is productivity and profit. So in my opinion, these arguments for DEI initiatives are rooted in the advancement of the neoliberal project, right? Free market capitalism, globalism, limited welfare state that does not invest in kind of alleviating the structural issues that perpetuate these systems of oppression. So do these policies that at the corporate level or at the higher education level appear to benefit, who exactly does it benefit? And who enjoys to benefit from these are majority people that are come from privileged backgrounds. So the next point I'd like to raise is, to what extent do marginalized individuals truly benefit from DEI initiatives? So is that relative to that of how much firms benefit in the form of a substantial increase in profitability? So in my opinion, DEI disproportionately favors a firm's interest rather than the lay working class person. The outcome of DEI still perpetuates a system of oppression in which people from the lower echelons receive a relatively small piece of the cake, despite the size increasing. So should DEI policies thus focus on taking into account the context and the institutions that perpetuate racism, ableism, and sexism? And another point I'd like to raise is about equity and inclusion, and more specifically, the meritocratic system, and how that's kind of oxymoronic and antithetical to equity. A meritocratic environment is inherently inequitable. As you move up the corporate ladder, or the career ladder in general, there are fewer positions of power available to people, and thus, in pursuing equity, is pursuing equity a pipe dream in our current economic system? Lastly, I'd like to bring up how, So if we can agree that it is in the organization's interest to pursue DEI policies as they increase profitability, then can we suggest that the fundamental values of DEI, which were initially feminist values, have they been co-opted by neoliberal dogma? And so the original emancipatory project has been erased, I'd like to argue, from contemporary DEI policies. So how at all are these initiatives directed at including women such that they can, shatter the glass ceiling, emancipatory in nature, when they simply reinforce those capitalistic institutions that breed and perpetuate discrimination and systems of oppression? Such policies simply reinforce the relations of power and oppression. They don't force us to look critically and evaluate them. So it seems to me that the pursuit of inclusive policies that attempt to shatter these glass ceilings, firms simply use them not as a genuine interest to attain justice, but rather of marginalized people, but rather as a means to an end, and that end being profitability and shareholder primacy. So I'd like to just end this with a quote from Audre Lorde. She tells us that diversity, and I'd like to add inclusivity, without structural change is simply tokenism, and tokenism is tolerance. So how should inclusive policies address exploitative praxis of structural dominance inherent in corporations? And in my opinion, these are genuine equity requires radical overhaul of our current economic systems. And you had argued that we have to look at the causes rather than the problems, the symptoms. And the causes are the structural ones that we are ignoring if we don't address them. And the current structure and the current the rollout of DEI policies ignores those.
Thank you very much, Kaden and Nayantara. I suppose it's very difficult to find a more eloquent way of simply pointing out that students don't need to be protected, they simply need to be invited to participate, than to see them participate. So thank you very much. We are now moving on to the final part of the evening, which is where we're going to put your questions, those I've now received on Slido, to our two guests. So that's the benefit. If we fly you out and we put you in a hotel and buy you dinner, you have to get your ideas bashed all night. That's the social contract. So try to move through these and try to get, it's quite a few. I doubt we can do them all, but I'll try to vary them a little bit. So let's just, all right, so let's pick the fourth down. In your experience or experiences, has there been change/evolution in how DEI statements are assessed for academic hiring? And it says in bracket in the last few years. So I think perhaps Azim answer that one.
It's a mess.
All right, succinct. Paolo, would you like to add to that?
I agree.
See, look.
You want more? Do you want more?
No, we can do many if we keep it at this pace. Okay, let's go down. Okay, here we go. This might prompt longer answers. Anti-Semitism is increasing on campus. Is there a way EDI, I guess it's EDI or DEI or IDE, pick your acronym, can help?
Should I take it? Do you want to go ahead?
You go first.
Okay. So sadly, I think what I've seen is actually that DEI has been flagged as one of the reasons for anti-Semitism on campuses. It's incredibly difficult. It's another one of these like, oh, it's too complicated. And it's certainly like a bit of a, I don't know, minefield to even touch upon that. There are horrible things that happen on the planet. We all agree. I think we can all have different opinions. I think as we were talking earlier about the difference between having sort of extreme viewpoints and having tolerance to those viewpoints and how you manage them, I think is where there's been a lot of angst and a lot of suffering. And I think that my personal opinion is that the fact that people who have been part of the anti-DEI backlash wave have used what has been deemed as an anti-Semitic wave in academia to say, oh, it's because of the DEI industry, et cetera, I think that's a pity. And I hope that most people will see through that as being just smoke and mirrors of people that are trying to lead up to the causes. So can DEI actually help that? I think that if we look at DEI very broadly, not just in terms of diversity of thought and recruiting more people and things like that, then I think that in principle, yes, it can help us all to learn to be more tolerant of people's viewpoints and have more open discussions. But I think it's a very tall order, and I think that would be one of the most challenging problems that I would certainly not want to have to get tangled with right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the things that I saw after October 7th was that a lot of the, let's call them small h heterodox people in the academy and beyond, the people who are free speech champions, once the tables were turned, it was interesting to see who kept to their principles and who didn't. Because I think what happens when people were free speech champions when they were not the targets of the speech that was coming out, and then the table is turned and then they become the target. It shows you that a lot of people are in this parochial sense where they adopt principles when they suit their particular position. And I think that's one of the big challenges. That's what makes it a principle, is that you adopt it when it doesn't suit your purpose. I think in my field there's been this it's just really annoying back and forth Twitter debate between two extremely outspoken people in social psychology who'd been outspoken before, but one is on one side and one is on the other, and it's really bringing out the worst in the two of them and in the field. But I think that this is one of those coordination challenges that come with diversity. We welcome the debate. We can't shield people from the fact that there are these disagreements out in the world. To try to say that, okay, we're going to use whatever policies we have at play to shut down these conversations on campus just doesn't prepare people for the fact that these conversations will continue once they're off campus.
All right, shall I move on to another question? So let's go with, I like these two. So let's go with one that's focusing a bit more on some of the data and the trends, and then we'll go to one that's a little more polemical. Why not? So this regards some of the data Azim was discussing about race attitudes dropping around 2010, and we have Jonathan Haidt's recent work on declining mental health in 2010 due to social media and smartphones. And the question is, similar mechanisms? So would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the points that that Jonathan made interestingly when he was talking about the changes in parenting over the last decades was that when CNN and other 24 hours news channels came online, what happened was a small number of abductions, child abductions, suddenly captured much more imagination in parents' heads than they previously had. Because now all of a sudden all these things were being played incessantly on CNN, even though they were small in number. The way our brains work is we have these things called the availability heuristic, which mistakes how readily something comes to mind with how actually frequent it's happening in the world. What you had in the emergence of a smartphone, camera-ready society plus a algorithmically driven social media society is that all these genuinely existent and terrible instances of racism became everywhere. They became everywhere. They made us, I think, exaggerate. I don't know if it's exaggerating, but they made us realize it more. Whether that means that we realized it inaccurately more or we were inaccurate before, I think it just did change our perception of the frequency, even as the frequency probably stayed reasonably similar. In fact, that's what the data do show, right? So when I was talking about that, the attitudes towards interracial marriage, those have continued to get more tolerant. I think somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the frequency of shooting of unarmed black men by police stayed pretty consistent over this time period. It may have, I don't know what's happened in the last few years, but I think it remained consistent throughout the aughts and tens. But what was different was that we became much more aware of it.
If I can add one thing to that, actually, yesterday I spent 8 hours in the car with my brother and sister-in-law. There was a topic that came up that was actually very related that I want to bring up, which is that we see this in the media as well, social media, but also we were talking about movies like The Hunger Games and The Giver. Some of these very dystopian kind of views that 20 years ago, or even longer than that, much longer ago, when I was a kid, those things just didn't really exist, or they're not very common. And so I think it's a combination of the internet coming of age, moving from, the internet is a cool new thing that we can use to do all kinds of things, to, now we can do this wonderful thing called social media, which is actually, I think, horrible, which makes conversations go on in places like, X, formerly known as Twitter. And there is a very interesting question of, are we seeing more movies? Are we seeing more information just simply because the medium is available to make that available? Are those movies like Hunger Games coming out because they see a trend and they reflect it? Or is it that media is actually driving then this kind of shift in opinion? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a very interesting question about which came first, the chicken or the egg. But it's certainly the ability to communicate things instantly, the ability to see live video of George Floyd lying on the ground for 9 minutes plus, and things like that change our society in a dramatic way, and I think that we're seeing some of that as well.
Yeah, I think the case, you mentioned this in your talk that George Floyd was a turning point, and it certainly was, but the data I showed that had turned before that, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Probably from Trayvon on, it had been, maybe that was more of a turning point. And then the reaction to George Floyd, I think, was a consequence of the fact that we were in a new place because of this.
Because of the COVID pandemic also. We were all glued to our screens all the time. Yeah.
Okay, so in the context of academic or campus spaces, and I suspect we could extend this beyond that, but still starting there, how does inclusion deal with free speech / hate speech? And I take it it's the second one that's the real challenge.
Personally, I think, I'm not an absolutist when it comes to free speech, but I do think that the US has a better balance than Canada has, and in particular the direction that Canada is going. I think that the concept of hate speech is always going to be nebulous and can be used by people in power to prevent us from being able to hear what is useful, right? So I think a lot of people in the audience here are going to be familiar with John Stuart Mill. He made the argument that two of the reasons that we need to hear about opposing viewpoints, one is that we might be wrong, fine, and then it's good to hear what is true. But it's also good to hear what is not true, because it helps us understand our own positions about what is true. I think that the idea of somebody putting their hands over our ears to protect us, I don't think it gives us enough credit. And I guess this comes back to some of the discussions that we were having about the inclusion of ideas versus the inclusion of people. Hate speech can really negatively affect people. Of course it can. It's also problematic to remove ideas from especially universities. So I think maybe especially universities are places where we are moving in a more censorious direction when we should be moving in a less censorious one.
No, I think that was very eloquent. Can't really add anything to that.
All right, I'm not challenging the eloquence of his response. I just want to know if you want to add anything to it. Someone's inviting me to ask a question. I will refuse to do so. This is not about me tonight. So, the question with the most thumbs up, I've only now realized there are thumbs up side questions. I didn't know you could vote on these things. I'm a philosopher, okay? By the way, you want to know parents who are upset about your career choice? We can talk about that, Azim. Okay, so neither Azim or Paolo, well, neither Azim nor Paolo discussed the role of critical race theory, parentheses and ideology, on EDI or DEI or whatever, and how this is impacting life on campus. Care to take this up?
So this is on par with anti-Semitism, I would say, in the sense that it's another very hot potato. I'm gonna start by pointing out that I am woefully ignorant about critical race theory. I mean, I've done some reading, but I would never want to pass myself for an expert. And in fact, one of the things that was very interesting for me is that when the whole first wave, after George Floyd, culminating from, as you said, built up before that, the work that I was doing in my startup was actually a very difficult time because people wanted unconscious bias training, they wanted racial sensitivity training, and it's like, look at me, I'm not gonna do that. I would be a liar if I tried to do that. With critical race theory, what I've seen is that unfortunately that again, a lot of times you take an idea that is in and of itself valid. I think academically it's definitely a field worth studying. I think what, in my opinion, has been not handled particularly well is when specific bits and pieces of that have been used as, in a way, almost a dogmatic way of presenting to people what they should and shouldn't think and what they should and shouldn't say, what they should and shouldn't do. And one thing that really struck me was in late 21, early 22, so before there was like the backlash, I was visiting some friends, some very dear friends, very white, very privileged. They live in a whiteopia, very good-meaning people. They would never think of themselves as being racist. And, you know, we can get into the whole racist, anti-racist thing, but they came to me one day and they said, listen, we're really concerned. And they showed me the sheet that their son had gotten in one of the classes that he was taking, in which basically was a table where it said, well, you know, if you're white, you're an oppressor, you're racist, you're taking advantage of all the systems, if you're black or, you know, all these other things. And they were just shocked. And they were saying like, look, all of my kids and all of their friends are just like freaking out. They don't know what to do about this. It's really upsetting them. And that's when I thought, okay, again, I think even with the best of intentions, I know some people, I'm familiar with some academics that work in critical race theory. I think they're doing excellent work. But I think that taking an entire field of study that has taken centuries, literally, to build up and try to condense it down into a table of, you know, a little sheet and tell people this is what you should do, this is what you should not do, this is how you should identify, not identify, is where we've run into problems. But again, another very hot potato topic that can be, you know, touch on some really, really sore points, understandably.
Yeah, I think that the fact that there were so many thumbs up by that is a testament to how interesting a question it is to everybody. In fact, I guess that's what it means, which means that I feel bad for letting you guys down and not being able to give that fulsome a response to this. I'm also not an expert on it. The one thing I will say is something I mentioned in my talk, that I think that these anti-DEI laws that are coming up in different parts of the United States are a real shame in this regard. They're trying, I don't know how familiar you guys are with this, but they're trying to just remove these types of things from the curricula through force from the government, especially again on university campuses. I don't think that at all is appropriate. If a critical race theory is an idea, it's obviously an idea that has legs. It should be debated and like all the rest of the ideas. I don't think I have anything more to add about that.
Well, thank you. I would just add, if we're going to quote John Stuart Mill, he famously said that the man only knows his own side of the case, hardly knows that at all. So if you don't like ideas, prove you can knock them down. Censoring them is not a great idea. I will now turn to a question which is apparently the only person who wrote it on Zoom said a Slido. So I will be inclusive and read out their question. I also think it nicely relates to populism, or at least you can read it that way, which I think is an interesting, relevant topic. You can't encourage normal society to join if you shut them out. That's what is happening with the present-day academy in Canada. Inclusion means exclusion. And I think that one way you could read this use of language of normal society is precisely the kind of binary you get at the heart of populist theory, which is that you have the real people or the normal people or the average people, and you have then the elites, which you may think as more or less legitimate. And there's a conflictual nature between these two basic components of society. So maybe that's my political philosophy lens that's showing, but I thought this is a way of maybe reading that kind of question. Would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think higher ed has a real credibility problem right now. Talking about those laws being passed in Florida and Texas and elsewhere are a good illustration of that universities, the academy is embedded within a society, and if it ends up being too out of step with the society, well, it to some degree relies on the patronage of the society to exist. So it has to be cognizant of the fact that we are embedded there, and we owe that society, I think, we owe that society an ability to make justifiable conclusions on the basis of what we're talking about. That's why I think that devotion to rigor, that devotion to science, that keeping up our methods is so important. Once we start letting go of that, then there is no reason for them to trust us. And you do have this massive decline, not just among the conservative side, though much more sharply among the conservative side, for their esteem in higher ed. I think that's the thing that probably worries me the most. The only place where I can see what's happening with regards to DEI as at all an existential threat to the academy is if we lose the beneficence of the society that we're part of, if we lose our credibility with society. And I do worry that happens, that might happen.
I mean, I would just add to that, I think a broader reflection on the same kinds of issues is the fact that I'm gravely concerned about the polarization that is happening right now. And there's a tendency for, and I have to say, I pinpoint a particular thing that happened a long time ago, 20 some odd years ago, when basically George Bush, W. Bush, and then other after that basically made the comments along the lines of, you know, they're doing this, they hate us because we're good, they're evil. And there was that very sharp line that was drawn. It was no longer grayscale, it was black and white. And I think that I saw that, I remember hearing that and just thinking, this is not good. Because the moment that you take the liberty to say what is good and what is not good, you're basically giving anyone license, you know, and then when you label them as terrorism on top of that, you're giving anyone license to label somebody in a way that you say, yeah, they're not like us and we hate them. And I'm seeing a lot of that, and I think that unfortunately, that's an area in which I think the academy is particularly vulnerable to that, precisely because of the fact that in the academy, people do not look at things in black and white. People reject that kind of, you know, you're either here or there, and you're trying to fight with societal forces outside of the academy that are very easy to lull into believing these false dichotomies. And that's, I think, I agree with you. I think it is actually a huge threat because the moment that you lose faith in science, and let's also say another thing that's happening is the attempts to undermine the credibility of the media. I mean, these days, basically, everything that everybody else is saying is fake news. And, you know, those of us that listen to certain news channels think everybody else is fake news and vice versa. And that really, really gravely concerns me, which is why I think that trying to come up with very simple arguments, very simple, and sometimes maybe giving up a little bit of that academic rigor, which is in a way what I'm doing. I'm sacrificing some academic rigor in my work so that I can speak to people that are not academics who will hopefully understand something out of it. I think that's actually I consider it to be a very difficult but very important part of the work that I do.
I'll add one more thing, which is that I think the role of Heterodox Academy can be a real bright light here, because I think that it can return some of the credibility by just showing that there is a response to this, right? That there is a recognition of some of the drift of the academy. And I think when I've talked to conservatives, which is not often, not as often as it should be, and I mention the academy, either they've already heard of it and are big fans, or they're so surprised that something like this exists in the academy. And I think that to show that we're not just a monolith that's in opposition to all these other parts of society, I think can return some of that credibility, or at least can puncture a mistakenly extreme view that the rest of the public might have of the academy.
All right, let's go with the second highest voted question that's not an ad hominem attack on someone on stage. Popularity is not always a proof of quality. Should equity be more heavily considered as a component of DEI to enhance both diversity and inclusion? Why was equity less spoken on in both presentations? There's a nice little challenging question to end things.
Do you have a definition of equity?
So this is, I think, the answer to your question is I have a definition of equity, but one of the problems is that both inclusion and equity, there are so many definitions, they're so different, which is one of the reasons why I came up with the definitions that I gave, which are ridiculously simple, and of course you have to explain something behind them. I've talked to people whose idea of inclusion is referring to how individuals feel. I've talked to people that talk about how inclusion has to do with processes, how it has to do with institutions, and as long as we do not have a shared and clear understanding of basic definitions like inclusion and equity, I think that's a big problem. My definition of equity, which I co-opted these terms, I basically said, look, when I look at the terms out there, the most famous definition of inclusion is the one by Verne Myers, or credit to Verne Myers, who said, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. I like that definition because it's very intuitive, but how are you going to use that as the leader of a university? How are you going to use that as a CEO? Unless you're running a party company, right? What are you going to do with that? And that's like the only definition that I've heard that people will agree upon. You want to go online and look for definitions of equity. I don't know if you've seen those pictures of the trees bending one way or the other, or the kids looking behind the fence, and then they get into arguments with one another about, no, that's not right, because you shouldn't be painting those kids this way, because it's a mess. And I think that the fact that those do not get talked about is precisely because there are insufficiently rigorous definitions. In fact, they're insufficiently rigorous. There are like no consistent definitions at all. So equity, in my mind, it's a desirable outcome, because if you have true equity, then people are being treated the same way, they have the same outcomes, they have the same ability to succeed, and that's ultimately what I think will make organizations motivated to do the right thing.
I want to thank both of you immensely and very heartily for all your work here tonight. I also want to thank our two undergraduate commentators, and I finally want to thank you.
And that I think one of the very important things about doing this and being public about this is it creates a critical mass of faculty and students. And that critical mass can then question the sacred cows that are out there, which is not to say that they're wrong, right? But the whole point of what we do here is to question things. And there were many questions that were combative and questions that were put in the Slido that didn't get asked. And I'm certainly one to say, and anyone here who has ever dealt with me would know, you're very, very welcome to come up and ask those questions to me, although you won't get the sort of benefit of being anonymous, you will get an honest answer. And I think that's true of pretty much everyone here. We come from very diverse intellectual viewpoints up here. And it is the case that we do share one thing, however, which is a commitment to evidence and a commitment to good faith dialogue and good faith answering questions. So I hope that you enjoyed this 2 hours of your life, and I hope you come back, and I hope you take part in many of our future events. Thank you so much.